In a word, choice. It's essential to equitable housing access and housing stability. It's a housing leasing strategy rather than a housing model. So local government agencies, non-profits, lease a number of units. Now that can look at differently for different people. So it might be scattered site, it might be clustered. You might have one landlord, you might have half a dozen landlords who are providing your units. The key principle is that the non-profit leases the units from the property owners and then subleases the individual units to households who are experiencing homelessness. So why? Why consider global leasing? So we know that housing providers continue to struggle to find affordable, safe, stable housing. We also know that people who experience homelessness will find it even harder to do that than the housing providers. We know that service providers want to prioritize supporting individuals and families with the hardest to serve, those that have the biggest needs. And then when we looked at property owners, they wanted an easy life. They wanted to be able to hand over their property in the knowledge that it would look good at the end, that the rent would be paid on time every month, and that their lives were as drama-free as possible. And what we found is that if it's implemented correctly, particularly around housing first principles, it can provide answers to all three issues. I can talk, for hours about the benefits, and I want to talk about the risks and how, the lack of autonomy can be mitigated. So the individual household is a subtenant. So the agency and the property owner sign that lease, and in most cases, they provide a sublease to the person they're housing. That means that unless you, as a housing provider, are very good at understanding federal and state law, it's not clear where they're protected under landlord or tenant law when things go wrong. And that was a lesson learned that many of the agencies that are doing global leasing told us themselves. They'd had to really educate themselves. And so when you look at our toolkit that's coming out, we'll be suggesting that you have somebody who understands law as it relates to subtenants. So we also realize that providers need to ensure that staff understand the eviction process. They understand any processes that involve your tenants or your subtenants and what their rights and what their responsibilities are. We also realized, and this is a classic housing first principle, that when the global leasing providers control the screening process, it means there's a potential for bias. There's a potential for an equity bias, but there's also a potential for other biases as well. When when the providers say, we'll take the person with the lesser needs. And then finally, the occupancy agreements that were developed is only as good as the non-profit agency that is administering those. We found staff were treating subtenants more like program participants, like the same rules as a shelter. How do we mitigate? In a word, choice. It's essential to equitable housing access and housing stability. With global leasing, there is more risk that choice is limited, which gives barriers to tenants and subtenants having those choices. Lead with your organizational values. Know your organizational values. If you believe choice is paramount to self-determination, where can you build in choice? Do you want scattered site? Do you want clustered units? And think about whether a combination would be good or not. Some people want that peer support, they want that clustered apartments. Others want scattered site. Engage your subtenants from the very beginning in strategizing and building a policy and procedure around that. So, because by the time they get to sign the lease agreement, it's a little bit too late to say, we should consider more choice. And then consider a transfer system that allows your subtenants to move within the community. Be intentional about your equitable strategies. Involve your subtenants in the development of goals. Train people to understand the impact of structural racism in an equitable access for housing for people of colour, and make a collective commitment. The equity piece is critical. Integrate peer support. You know, we're realising that it's not just people with lived experience, it's peers that can make the difference on these programmes, and global leasing is no different. They help reduce stigma and they support part of that case management approach towards goals. And then have a neutral third-party system that allows people to complain and go through a grievance process where you're not just bumping up the management levels of the organisation that you're complaining against. Housing First is critical within this. So think about this. What we found was that the ones who succeeded most made things like services and supports voluntary, not mandating them. They separated their housing structure from their service structure so that the same person didn't sit there telling them, why did you throw the chair into the wall, and saying you'll have to pay for that, and then 10 minutes later and say, I want to talk to you about your substance use disorder. Rarely that goes well, and a lot of global leasing providers have separated their housing from their services because it just works so much better. Have an understanding of fair housing. As non-profits, we often don't really jump into the world of fair housing, and it's critical that they do understand that. And then train your staff around what the difference is between occupancy agreements and tenants and subtenants' rights.